dust settles over the plains, revealing a silence that feels heavier than the roar of battle which preceded it. Under the unforgiving sun of the Levant, the ground is carpeted with the wreckage of an empire. 17 minutes. That is the staggering reality of what occurred here. In less time than it takes to prepare a meal, the finest military machine in the Islamic world was not merely defeated, it was erased. On paper, this engagement should have been a massacre of the Christian forces. The mathematics of war are usually absolute, and the numbers were terrifying. Saladin brought an army of 20,000 veteran soldiers, rested and confident, against a scattered, starving crusader force that had been marching toward its own funeral. The sheer weight of the Islamic army should have crushed the resistance instantly. Instead, the aftermath tells a different story. 7,000 of Saladin's elite lie dead in the sand, while the crusaders count fewer than 700 casualties. It is a 10-to-1 kill ratio that defies the physics of medieval combat. This was not a skirmish, nor was it a stroke of luck. It was an anomaly. We are looking at a force led by a boy whose body was rotting while he breathed, a leper king barely able to hold his reins. Yet, this dying commander and his 400 knights executed the single most devastating heavy cavalry charge in recorded history. To understand how a dead man walking broke the back of a superpower, we must look past the steel and the blood, and into the desperate strategic mind of a king who had absolutely nothing left to lose. On paper, the engagement is a statistical absurdity. In any war college, in any era, placing 400 knights against an army of 20,000 is not a battle plan. It is a suicide note. To understand why the suicide note became a death warrant for the Ayyubid army, we must first accept that the victory at Montcassar defies the conventional laws of military gravity. Warfare in the Levant was never about brute force. It was a game of agonizing patience. We see the pinnacle of this doctrine years later with Richard the Lionheart, who would march for 7 days under a relentless rain of Saracen arrows, watching his men fall one by one, refusing charge until the geometric moment was perfect. That is the standard of discipline required to survive the desert. But Baldwin did not have the luxury of Richard's numbers, nor the time to play a game of attrition. He was operating on a different frequency of desperation. This leads us to the second anomaly, Saladin himself. The Sultan was not a careless amateur. He was a grand master of maneuver warfare. His entire strategic identity relied on space, speed, and the absolute refusal to engage heavy European cavalry head-on. Yet, on this specific morning, the master of mobility allowed his light cavalry to be trapped. He allowed his army to become congested, lethargic, and blind. He allowed the hammer to find the anvil. History often labels this a miracle, but miracles explain nothing. This was not a victory of divine intervention, nor was it simply a clash of weapons. It was a triumph of psychological endurance. The Franks did not win because they had better swords. They won because they possess a discipline that can only be forged when the only alternative to victory is total extinction. To see how the trap was sprung, we must dismantle the mind of a commander who knew his own clock was ticking faster than anyone else's on the field. To understand the sheer lunacy of the gamble Baldwin was about to take, we must first look beyond the horizon to the terrifying geopolitical reality of 1177. The Latin kingdom was no longer a conqueror. It was a besieged island in a rising Islamic sea. For decades, the survival of Jerusalem had relied on the disunity of its enemies, a fractured map of squabbling sultans and emirs that allowed the Crusaders to survive in the gaps between them. But that era of division was dead. Saladin had done the impossible. He had welded the agricultural wealth of Egypt to the warrior ethos of Syria, forging a unified empire that wrapped around the Christian states like a python coiling around a ribcage. The strategic nightmare that every Crusader king had feared for 80 years had finally arrived. The enemy was now united, driven by a single will, and commanded by a man who viewed the expulsion of the Franks not as a war for territory, but as a divine mandate. The psychological atmosphere within the walls of Jerusalem was one of suffocating dread. The nobility whispered that the kingdom was living on borrowed time. They looked at their king, a boy rotting alive, barely able to hold the reins of a horse, and then they looked at Saladin, a leader who projected an aura of absolute, godlike invincibility. In the eyes of the Muslim world, and indeed in the private fears of the Christian court, the war was already over. The Crusaders were viewed as a walking ghost, a remnant of a past age waiting to be swept into the sea. Baldwin was not just fighting a superior army. He was fighting the crushing weight of inevitable history. He was fighting a reputation that said resistance was futile. To Saladin, this campaign was intended to be a victory lap, a final administrative cleanup to erase the Christian stain from the Levant. But in assuming the outcome was written, the Sultan had made the one mistake that often topples empires. He forgot that a cornered animal, with nothing left to lose, is the most dangerous creature on earth. To understand the slaughter that was about to unfold, one must first understand the minds that orchestrated it. War is rarely decided by numbers alone. It is decided by the men who command them. And the Battle of Ramla was a collision between two titans who viewed the world through fundamentally different lenses. On one side stood Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to the west as Saladin. He was the eagle of Egypt and Syria, a man who was not merely a warlord, but a statesman of the highest order. Saladin's genius lay in his patience. He had spent decades stitching together the fractured Islamic world, not always through bloodshed, but through diplomacy, piety, and an intricate understanding of logistics. He was a commander who weaponized the environment itself, using the scorching sun, the dust, and the parched throat as his most loyal lieutenants. To Saladin, war was a game of chess played on a grand scale, where attrition and maneuver were preferred over the chaotic gambles of a frontal charge. He looked at the kingdom of Jerusalem and saw a fruit ripe for the plucking, governed by a decaying boy. Opposing him was that boy, Baldwin IV, the leper king. If Saladin was a master of the physical world, Baldwin was a triumph of the spirit over rotting flesh. He was 16 years old, his body actively consuming itself, his nervous system failing to the point where he could no longer feel the reins of his horse. By all conventional logic, he should have been invalid, hidden away in the dark corners of a palace. Instead, he was a warrior king who had to be strapped to his saddle, his sword hand bound to the hilt because his fingers refused to grip. Yet, beneath the bandages and the physical ruin lay a tactical mind as sharp and cold as a Damascus blade. Baldwin possessed a terrifying clarity that comes only to those with an expiration date. He knew he could not win a long war. His body would not allow it. He could not outmaneuver Saladin in a campaign of months or years. He needed immediate violent resolution. This was the deadly dynamic at play. Saladin operated on the assumption of logic. He believed that a vastly outnumbered, crippled teenager would do the sensible thing: retreat behind the high walls of Jerusalem and prepare for a siege. It was a textbook move. It was a safe move. But Baldwin knew that safety was an illusion. He understood that a defensive war against the limitless resources of Egypt and Syria was merely a slow suicide. He knew that Saladin expected him to play the prey, to cower and wait for the end. So, the young king decided to do the one thing the Sultan's master plan did not account for. He decided to stop playing chess, and instead flip the board entirely. The Sultan believed he was marching toward a coronation. He did not realize he was walking into the cage of a lion that had absolutely nothing left to lose. To change the game, Richard did not sprint toward Jerusalem. He turned his back to the holy city and looked south, toward the coast. What followed was not a campaign of speed, but a masterclass in weaponized geometry. He ordered his army into a formation that history would remember as the moving fortress. It was a tactic born of cold, calculating logic. Offshore, the Crusader fleet shadowed the army, a floating supply line ensuring that while the desert demanded thirst, Richard's men had water. On land, he constructed a human box designed to absorb punishment. On the outer perimeter marched the heavy infantry, men clad in thick felt padding beneath chainmail, walking shoulder to shoulder, their shields locked together to form a continuous wall of wood and steel. Deep inside this protective shell rode the heavy cavalry, the elite Templars and Hospitallers, the coiled spring of the army, shielded from the enemy's arrows, waiting for the singular moment to strike. For the Saracens, this formation was maddening. Saladin's mounted archers, usually the arbors of death in the open sands, found their tactics rendered useless. They swarmed the column like angry wasps, darkening the sky with arrows, but the projectiles merely bounced off the heavy European shields or caught harmlessly in the infantry's padding. The Crusaders did not break rank. They did not chase the bait. They simply walked, 10 agonizing miles a day, under a blistering sun, enduring a torrent of abuse and steel with a discipline that was more terrifying than a war cry. Saladin watched from the hills, his frustration mounting. He saw that this was not an army he could chip away at. It was a juggernaut that ignored him. He realized that to destroy the lion, he could not rely on harassment. He needed a massacre. He looked ahead to the terrain and saw his opportunity at the forest of Arsuf. Here, the plain narrowed, squeezing the coastal road between dense woods and the sea. It was a natural kill zone, a corridor where Richard's box would be force compressed, where the geometric perfection would inevitably falter. Saladin began to mass his entire army there, preparing to pin the Crusaders against the water and drive them into the surf. The trap was set, the jaws were open, and Richard was marching straight into the throat of the beast. To understand why the coming clash was not merely a battle, but a collision of two incompatible worlds, we must look past the numbers and examine the machinery of death itself. On the dusty plains of Ramla, two distinct philosophies of warfare were about to intersect. Saladin's vanguard was built on the doctrine of evasion and attrition. His Mamluk horse archers were the apex of mobility, riding light, agile Arabian Maras that could turn on a coin and outpace the wind. They did not seek to hold ground. They sought to dissolve before contact. Their primary tool was a composite bow, a laminate of wood, horn, and sinew that could punch through mail at close range or rain harassment from a distance. Their strategy was mathematical. Keep the enemy at arm's length, bleed them with 1,000 cuts, and never, under any circumstances, allow the heavy blow to land. To a Mamluk, a stationary fight was a lost fight. Opposing this fluid speed was a Frankish knight, a weapon system designed for a singular, catastrophic moment of violence. These men were walking fortresses, encased in 40 pounds of riveted iron rings and padded gambesons. But their true power lay in the physics of the mount. They rode destriers, massive, aggressive stallions bred not for speed, but for raw torque and temper. When a Crusader knight locked his lance under his arm and spurred his mount, he ceased to be a man on a horse. He became a single, fused projectile. The science behind the charge is terrifyingly simple. It is a matter of mass times velocity. 1,000 pounds of armor, horse, and rider, concentrating all that kinetic energy into the steel tip of a lance, generates force comparable to a modern automobile crash. It does not just pierce, it shatters. It creates a shock wave that breaks bones, ruptures organs, and liquefies morale. This was the asymmetry of the battlefield. Saladin's victory relied on time, space, and the ability to avoid the impact forever. The Crusaders' survival relied on closing the gap. They possessed a weapon of absolute devastation, but it was a weapon with only one shot. If the charge connected, it would shatter the Saracen lines like glass. If it hit empty air, the knights would be swallowed by the swarm, exhausted and butchered in the dust. The king had to bet his entire reign on a single, synchronized moment of impact. But before the hammer could fall, the anvil had to hold. What followed was not a battle, but a slow-motion execution that stretched over 7 agonizing days. The Crusaders were forced to march down the coast, trapped between the indifferent sea and a horizon that had come alive with enemies. The heat sat at a suffocating 115 degrees, turning chainmail into a convection oven that cooked the men inside their own armor. Dehydration was a specter as dangerous as the enemy, yet to stop for water was to be overrun. From the dunes, the psychological assault was relentless. The constant, rhythmic thunder of Muslim drums rolled over the column, a heartbeat of impending violence designed to shatter the nerves of men who had not slept in days. Then came the sound that every veteran dreaded, the dry, high-pitched hiss of the whistling death. Saladin's horse archers, swarming like angry wasps, unleashed a torrent of arrows that darkened the midday sun. It is estimated that 400,000 shafts were loosed upon the marching line, a relentless industrial slaughter that turned the air itself into a weapon. This was a supreme test of Western discipline, a torture far worse than the chaos of melee combat. To a European knight, bred from birth for the aggression of the charge, passivity is agony. They were forced to walk at a funeral pace, watching their prized war horses stumble and die, pinned with a dozen arrows. They watched brothers in arms drop silently into the dust, shaft protruding from their necks, and they could do nothing but close the gap in the line and keep walking. Every instinct screamed for them to break rank, to lower their lances and ride down their tormentors in a blaze of glory. But the order from King Richard was absolute, passed down the line with the cold finality of iron. No one moves until the signal. To break formation was to die. To charge early was to hand Saladin the victory he was desperate to provoke. So they marched in a gauntlet of terrifying silence, swallowing their rage, stepping over the fallen, and waiting for the singular, explosive second when the tension would finally snap. By the seventh day, the march south had ceased to be a military maneuver and had become a slow-motion execution. The rear guard, manned by the elite Knights Hospitaller, was no longer a formation of war, but a moving wall of meat and iron, absorbing a relentless, stinging rain of Saracen arrows. Men and horses were walking pincushions, their padded gambesons thick with shafts. The heat of the sun conspired with the enemy to strip away their sanity layer by layer. In the command center, the tension was suffocating. Grand Master Garnier de Nablus, a man forged in the fires of holy war, rode forward a king, his voice trembling not with fear, but with an incandescent fury. He reported that his horses were being killed beneath his knights, and that his men could no longer endure the shame of passivity. He begged for the signal to charge. He pleaded to be unleashed. But the order from the king was absolute. Wait, the trap was not yet set. The column had to keep moving until the enemy was fully committed. Garnier rode back to the rear, swallowing his rage, forced to watch his brothers die without striking back. Saladin, watching from the ridgeline, misread this terrifying discipline for defeat. He saw the Crusaders trudging with heads bowed, taking losses without retaliation, and he concluded that their spirit was finally broken. He believed they were no longer lions, but cattle waiting for the slaughter. Sensing the kill, Saladin ordered his drums to beat a frantic rhythm and committed his reserves. Thousands of mounted archers and heavy cavalry swarmed down from the hills, closing the distance to mere yards, screaming insults and hurling javelins into the backs of the Hospitallers. The pressure became a physical weight, heavier than armor, heavier than duty. The line between discipline and survival vanished. It happened in a fraction of a second. There was no trumpet blast, no royal decree, and no strategic signal. Two knights, the marshal of the hospital and a companion, simply could not take another step. Their instinct for self-preservation overrode their orders. They spurred their horses, lowered their lances, and burst through the infantry screen with a roar that shattered the silence. Garnier de Nablus, seeing the breach, made a split-second choice that would decide the fate of the crusade. He did not call them back. He roared St. George and spurred his own mount forward. In an instant, the entire rear guard exploded outward like a pressurized vessel rupturing. The carefully laid plan was in ruins. The formation was shattered, and the Crusaders were now charging headlong into a chaotic melee that the king had explicitly forbidden. In the chaotic arithmetic of war, a broken plan usually equals a massacre. But Richard is not a man paralyzed by doctrine. He sees the Hospitallers break rank, charging into the enemy's swarm, and realizes instantly that the defensive posture is dead. To hesitate now, to attempt to recall the rogue knights, would only leave them isolated and butchered. He has a fraction of a second to make a choice that will define the Third Crusade. He does not try to stop the avalanche. He decides to guide it. Richard signals a general engagement. 3 distinct, piercing blasts from the royal trumpets cut through the din of battle, echoing down the line from the center to the rear guard. It is the signal every knight has been agonizingly waiting for since dawn. The discipline that held them in place for hours now transforms into a terrifying, synchronized aggression. The infantry lines, battered and bleeding, suddenly part, opening gaps in the shield wall like floodgates. Through these channels pours the heavy cavalry of Europe. 2,000 armored knights, mounted on massive destriers, transition from a standstill to a full gallop in heartbeat. The ground begins to tremble, a low-frequency rumble that builds into a deafening roar. This is not a skirmish. It is a kinetic event. The physics of the charge are merciless. You have half a ton of horse, armor, and rider, multiplied by 2,000, accelerating into a solid wall of steel and muscle. Saladin's forces, who have been venturing closer and closer to harass the passive Crusader line, are caught in a catastrophic position. They are like cavalry and archers, designed for speed and maneuverability, not for absorbing impact. They are caught flat-footed, their horses turned sideways or standing still, mere yards from the Crusader line. They attempt to turn, to flee, to scatter, but the distance is too short and the acceleration of the knights is too violent. The collision is less a battle and more an industrial accident. The Crusader charge slams into the Saracen line with the force of a tidal wave hitting a picket fence. The front ranks of Saladin's army do not fight. They simply vanish. Men and horses are shattered by the impact of the couched lances, trampled into the dust before they can even raise their scimitars. The dense formations of the Mamluks, which have been the hunters all morning, are vaporized in seconds. The momentum of the charge carries the knights deep into the enemy rear, turning the disciplined Saracen army into a panicked stampede, as the Lionheart finally unsheathes his sword to join the slaughter. What followed was not a battle. It was a liquidation. The collision of heavy Frankish cavalry against the light, unprepared armor of the Saracen forces was a matter of simple, brutal physics. The kinetic energy of 400 armored war horses, focused into the tips of lowered lances, did not merely break the enemy line. It shattered the structural integrity of Saladin's army. For 7 days, these knights had marched in silence, enduring the heat, the thirst, and the taunt of an enemy that vastly outnumbered them. Now, that suppressed rage was released in a single, concentrated kinetic burst. They did not fight for territory or glory in those first moments. They fought with the primal ferocity of men who had already accepted their own deaths and found themselves miraculously alive. The charge arrived in 3 devastating waves. The Hospitallers struck first, a wedge of black steel that punched through the disorganized Saracen vanguard as if it were parchment. They did not stop to engage individual soldiers. They rode through them, trampling the fallen under iron-shod hooves. Behind them, the center crashed home, turning the confusion into a rout, hewing down men who were too terrified to raise their shields. Finally, the Templars arrived on the flank, closing the trap with a terrifying mechanical efficiency. There was no tactical maneuvering left to be done. The battlefield dissolved into chaos, dust, and screaming. Saladin, positioned at the rear, watched in paralyzed horror as his grand strategy evaporated before his eyes. His personal Mamluk guard, the elite warriors of the Ayyubid Empire, formed a desperate ring around the Sultan, but they were not fighting infantry. They were trying to stem a tide of heavy iron. One by one, the Mamluks were ridden down, their discipline meaningless against the sheer weight of the Crusader impact. The Sultan of Egypt and Syria, the man who held the East in his palm, was nearly taken. There was no dignity in his escape. He was dragged from the field by his panicked retainers, hoisted onto a racing camel, and forced to flee into the desert, leaving his army to the mercy of men who had none. In less than 20 minutes, the cohesion of 20,000 men had ceased to exist. The dust began to settle over the valley, revealing a landscape transformed. It was no longer a battlefield, but a slaughterhouse, where the pride of an empire lay broken in the sand, and the myth of Saladin's invincibility was washed away in blood. The silence that descends upon a battlefield after the killing stops is heavy, suffocating, and deceptive. As the dust settled over the carnage, the path ahead seemed clear. Saladin's forces were scattering, their formation shattered, retreating toward the rugged safety of the hills. To the average soldier, flushed with the adrenaline of survival and the bloodlust of triumph, the command seemed obvious. Chase them down. Finish it. The road to the holy city appeared to be paved with the bodies of their enemies, wide open for the taking. But from the vantage point of command, Richard saw a different reality. He looked not at the fleeing backs of Saracens, but at the heaving flanks of his own cavalry. The charge had been decisive, but it had pushed biological limits to the breaking point. The destriers, the heavy European war horses that acted as the tanks of the crusade, were blown. Their coats were lathered in white foam, their legs trembling. To push them uphill into the rocky terrain now would not be a pursuit. It would be a death sentence to the mounts that were the army's only advantage. Furthermore, the men inside the steel were cooking alive. After hours of combat under the merciless Levantine sun, dehydration had set in. The adrenaline that fueled the charge was crashing, leaving behind a lethargy that makes armies slow, stupid, and vulnerable. Richard knew that Saladin, though beaten, was a master of the feigned retreat. The Sultan was wounded, not dead. If the Crusaders stretched their line into the hills, chasing shadows into the twilight, they would lose their cohesion. A disorganized column is easy prey for a reorganized enemy, and Saladin still held reserves hidden in the jagged geography of the interior. So, the Lionheart did the hardest thing a commander can do in the wake of a rout. He stopped. He ordered the standards to hold fast. He chose the certainty of survival over the gamble of total annihilation. It was a decision born of cold, military calculus, prioritizing the preservation of his force over the emotional satisfaction of the chase. He saved his army from a potential massacre in the hills, keeping the crusade alive to fight another day. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, a darker truth began to settle over the camp. By sparing his men the risk of the hills, Richard may have allowed the enemy just enough time to regroup and fortify the ultimate prize. The army was safe, but the momentum was gone, and the gates of Jerusalem began to feel further away than ever before. The dream of immediate conquest had evaporated in the heat of the Judean summer, but what remained in the dust of the battlefield was perhaps more significant than the taking of the city. For the first time since the catastrophic Horns of Atene, the spell was broken. The psychological stranglehold that Saladin held over the Christian world had been dismantled piece by bloody piece. For years, the Sultan had been viewed not merely as commander, but as a force of nature, a divine punishment sent to scour the Franks from the earth. But this campaign had revealed the mortal man beneath the myth. Saladin, the great unifier of Islam, had been outmaneuvered and outfought in the open field. He looked upon the devastation of his heavy cavalry and realized a terrifying truth. The tactic of swarming attrition, which had drowned so many armies before, shattered uselessly against the disciplined iron wall of the European heavy infantry. The strategic fallout was immediate and absolute. Saladin, a man known for his boldness, retreated into a doctrine of extreme caution. He would never again dare to meet the Lionheart in a pitched, open battle. The risk of total annihilation was simply too high. Instead, the war dissolved into a grim game of shadows, ambushes, scorched earth, and logistical strangulation. The Sultan understood that while he could not defeat this enemy with the sword, he could perhaps starve them of their will. This shift in psychology rippled through the ranks on both sides. The coastal cities, seeing that the tide of invincibility had receded, accepted the new reality. The Muslims realized the Franks could not be swept into the sea. The Crusaders realized they lacked the manpower to hold the interior. It was an immovable object meeting an unstoppable force, resulting in a friction that ground both empires down to their breaking points. Exhaustion, not chivalry, paved the road to the negotiating table. The resulting Treaty of Jaffa was not a celebration of peace, but a formal admission of stalemate. It secured the coastal strip for the Christians and allowed unarmed pilgrims access to Jerusalem, yet left the holy city itself in Muslim hands. It was an imperfect end to a brutal struggle, born from the realization that total victory was no longer possible for either king. The wars would continue, the borders would shift, but the era of undisputed domination was over. The Lionheart would sail home, leaving behind a Levant that had been forever altered, not by the capture of a capital, but by the death of a myth. As the red dust of the Levant settled over the broken bodies of the Ayyubid vanguard, the true magnitude of what had transpired began to take shape. History often fixates on the climax of battle, the thunder of the hospitable charge, the shattering of lances, the visceral release of violence. But to focus on the charge is to misunderstand the victory. The Battle of Arsuf was not won when the Crusaders lowered their lances. It was won in the agonizing hours when they refused to raise them. For miles, these men walked into a furnace, tormented by heat, thirst, and a relentless iron rain, denied the basic soldier's right to strike back. To endure such provocation without breaking requires a strength far rarer than courage. It requires a suppression of survival instinct that borders on the unnatural. Saladin had bet his empire on the assumption that the Franks were merely brutal, reactive warriors. He believed that if he pricked them enough, they would bleed their cohesion into the sand. He was wrong. Richard had forged a force that could turn suffering into a weapon. He taught them that restraint was not passivity, but a coiled spring, gathering tension with every arrow that glanced off their mail. By the time that energy was finally released, it did not just defeat an army, it shattered an aura of invincibility. Saladin, the master of mobility and psychological warfare, had been broken by a wall of immovable iron as the sun dipped low over the Mediterranean, casting long shadows over the carnage. The Crusaders did not cheer in wild triumph. They knelt in the dust, exhausted, battered, yet standing on the field they had conquered. They had proven that in the theater of war, the sword determines who dies, but discipline determines who remains. The Lionheart had shown the world that the hardest battles are not fought against the enemy, but against the urge to act before the moment is right. And in that silence, amidst the ruin of Saladin's ambition, the myth of the untouchable Sultan was finally laid to rest.